The day unfolded with deceptive calm inside the vast mansion, where silence often felt heavier than noise. Morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long reflections across marble floors polished to perfection. Yet the beauty of the place did nothing to ease Maria's restless heart. She moved through the kitchen with the same careful precision she had practiced for years, preparing breakfast exactly as instructed, aligning plates, checking temperatures, correcting details no one ever noticed aloud, but would immediately feel if they were wrong. For 7 long years, this house had been her world. She had learned its rhythms better than her own breathing, learned when to speak and when to disappear, learned how wealth could surround people with comfort while slowly draining warmth from their lives. Tucked securely into the pocket of her apron was a folded letter, pressed flat by nervous hands during a sleepless night. It was not long, not dramatic, and not written in anger. It was simply the truth, written as gently as possible, because Maria had learned that harsh truths were rarely welcomed here. As she poured coffee into an expensive porcelain cup imported from Europe, she stared at the dark liquid swirling inside and wondered how many times she had stood in this same spot, watching life repeat itself while something inside her quietly changed. She remembered the early days, when she had first arrived at the mansion, intimidated by its size and by the man who owned it. Alexander Reed had seemed distant then, powerful and untouchable, always moving too fast for emotions, too busy for questions. She had admired him once, admired his discipline and success, believed that such a man surely knew what he was doing. But admiration fades when observation lasts long enough. Over the years, Maria had seen more than she was meant to see. She had cleaned hallways late at night and overheard doctors speaking in low, urgent voices. She had carried trays past closed doors where arguments ended abruptly the moment her footsteps were heard. She had noticed patterns others dismissed, how treatments changed frequently but explanations stayed vague, how the children's conditions never truly improved despite endless promises. She told herself again and again that it was not her place, that she was only a housemaid, that professionals knew better. Yet doubt has a way of growing in silence, and by that morning, doubt had become something she could no longer carry alone. Taking a deep breath, Maria lifted the tray and walked toward the study, each step echoing softly in the grand hallway. Her heart beat faster as she approached the door, not from fear of losing her job, but from the weight of what staying would mean if she continued to say nothing. The door was slightly open, and inside sat Alexander Reed, already immersed in his work, his tailored suit flawless, his attention locked onto glowing screens filled with figures and reports that shaped companies and futures. To him, the day had started like any other, efficient and controlled. Maria knocked lightly and entered, placing the coffee on the desk with the familiar care he expected. For a brief second, everything felt normal, almost comforting, and she wondered if she should turn around and forget the letter altogether. Instead, she reached into her pocket and placed the envelope beside the cup. It looked fragile against the solid confidence of the desk. Alexander noticed it only as she turned to leave. "What's this?" he asked, his tone neutral, uninterested. Maria stopped, but did not turn around immediately. Her shoulders stiffened as if bracing for impact. "My resignation, sir," she said softly. The words felt unreal once spoken, as if they belonged to someone else. Alexander frowned slightly and finally looked up, more curious than concerned. "Staff changes were routine. Is there a problem with your pay?" he asked, already assuming the solution. "No, sir," she replied. "Do you need fewer hours?" "No." He leaned back in his chair now, irritation beginning to surface. Then why? There it was, the question she had rehearsed answers for 100 times, yet still struggled to face. Maria's fingers tightened at her sides, her mind filling with images she wished she could forget. The children's pale faces, the sound of coughing in the night, the uneasy feeling that settled in her chest whenever new doctors arrived with the same confident smiles and different explanations. "I can't stay anymore," she said, her voice steady but thin. "Please accept it." She did not explain further. She did not argue. She simply walked out, forcing her legs to move even as emotion threatened to slow her down. Alexander watched her leave, surprised by how final her tone had sounded. He picked up the envelope, intending to set it aside, but something about the moment lingered. Maria had never been impulsive, never careless with her words. Opening the letter, he began to read, expecting a polite goodbye. Instead, he found quiet concern, careful observations, and a sincerity that unsettled him more than anger ever could. As his eyes moved across the page, the room felt strangely smaller, the silence louder, and for the first time that morning, Alexander Reed sensed that something important had just slipped out of his control. The mansion felt different after Maria left the study, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the tension she carried out with her. Alexander remained seated for a long time, the resignation letter still open in his hands, its simple words echoing in his mind with an unexpected persistence. He tried to return his attention to the figures glowing on his screen, but the numbers blurred, refusing to arrange themselves into anything meaningful. Maria's careful sentences had planted a discomfort he could not dismiss. She had not accused him of neglect, nor had she demanded anything for herself. Instead, she had written about fear, about watching suffering unfold in quiet corners, about feeling complicit simply by staying silent. Alexander leaned back and exhaled slowly, telling himself it was nothing more than the emotional exaggeration of someone who had grown too attached. Housemaids, he reasoned, often mistook routine for insight. Yet the more he tried to rationalize it, the more the unease grew. The letter was not emotional. It was observant. That was what troubled him most. Rising from his chair, he walked to the window and looked out over the perfectly maintained grounds, lawns trimmed with mathematical precision, fountains flowing endlessly, as if even water obeyed his will here. Control had always been his strength. He had built his empire on certainty and decisiveness. But now, standing in his own home, he felt uncertain in a way that irritated him deeply. He folded the letter and slipped it into his jacket, intending to discuss it later with his legal team or his assistant, to file it away as another minor inconvenience. Instead, his feet carried him instinctively down the hallway, toward the children's wing of the house. The corridor was quiet, broken only by the soft hum of medical equipment and the faint rhythmic beeping that had become part of the household's background noise. Alexander paused outside the first bedroom door, listening. His son slept restlessly, his breathing shallow, his face too pale for a child his age. Doctors had assured him countless times that recovery was close, that improvement would come soon with the next treatment, the next adjustment, the next expensive solution. Alexander had believed them because belief was easier than doubt. He moved to his daughter's room next, watching her chest rise and fall unevenly, her small hand clutching a blanket as if it were the only stable thing in her world. Something tightened in his chest, an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel fully. Guilt brushed against him, unwelcome and sharp. He left the rooms quietly and returned to his study, closing the door behind him with more force than necessary. For the rest of the afternoon, he attempted to work, making calls, signing documents, issuing commands that were carried out immediately, efficiently, without question. Yet each moment of authority only highlighted what he could not command, the growing sense that something fundamental had been overlooked. When evening arrived, the mansion grew even quieter than usual. Dinner was served with polite efficiency by other staff, but Maria's absence was noticeable in small ways, details slightly misaligned, timing just a bit off. Alexander found himself staring at his plate, appetite gone, his thoughts circling back to the letter. Finally, unable to resist, he took it out again and reread it slowly, this time allowing himself to truly absorb every line. Maria wrote about patterns she had noticed, about conversations that ended abruptly when she entered a room, about treatments that changed without clear explanations, about symptoms that did not match what doctors claimed to be seeing. She never claimed expertise, only attention. That distinction lingered in Alexander's mind long after he finished reading. Attention, he realized, was something he himself had lacked at home. That night, sleep refused to come. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, memories resurfacing uninvited. He remembered times when Maria had hesitated before speaking, as if choosing her words carefully, times when he had dismissed her concerns with a nod and a wave of his hand, assuming she was simply worried like any caretaker might be. He had never truly listened. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. In the early hours of the morning, Alexander made a decision that surprised even himself. He called his assistant and asked for Maria's address. The pause on the other end of the line told him the request was unexpected. "I need to speak with her," he said firmly. "Today." After the call ended, he sat alone in the dim light of his study, surrounded by symbols of success that suddenly felt hollow. When Maria arrived later that day, summoned unexpectedly, she entered with visible hesitation, expecting confrontation or dismissal. Instead, she found Alexander standing by the window, his jacket off, his expression serious but not angry. He turned as she stepped inside, the letter in his hand. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" he asked quietly. The question held no accusation, only something dangerously close to vulnerability. Maria lowered her eyes, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Because people like me aren't supposed to question people like you," she replied softly. The honesty of her answer struck him harder than any criticism could have. He gestured for her to sit, something he had never done before. She hesitated, then obeyed. "Tell me everything," he said. And as Maria began to speak, carefully at first, then with growing clarity, Alexander listened in silence, realizing that the housemaid he had nearly let walk away might be the only person brave enough to tell him the truth. What followed Maria's quiet confession was not an explosion of anger or immediate certainty, but a slow, unsettling unraveling of everything Alexander Reed believed he understood. As she spoke, her voice remained steady, yet each word carried years of restrained observation. She described moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Doctors who avoided direct answers, medical files that were quickly closed when she entered the room, whispered phone calls late at night that mentioned approvals and deadlines rather than healing. She admitted she had questioned herself countless times, reminding herself she was not trained, not educated in medicine, just a woman paid to clean floors and serve meals. But repetition, she explained, teaches its own kind of knowledge. Alexander sat across from her, hands clasped tightly, his mind racing to reconcile her words with the assurances he had been given for years. He interrupted her only once, asking if she was certain of what she had heard. Maria did not claim certainty. She claimed consistency. That distinction unsettled him deeply. When she finished, the room fell into a silence thicker than before. Alexander stood abruptly, pacing the length of the study, his polished shoes echoing sharply against the floor. Control, the foundation of his identity, felt dangerously unstable. Yet beneath the discomfort, something else stirred, resolve. He stopped pacing and turned to her. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice firm. Maria looked up, startled, misunderstanding his meaning. "Sir, I didn't come here to negotiate," she replied quietly. "I came because you asked." Alexander shook his head. "I'm not negotiating either," he said. "I'm asking you to stay until I know the truth." For the first time since she had entered the room, Maria allowed herself to show emotion, fear mixed with relief in her eyes. She nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she was agreeing to. The days that followed transformed the mansion into a place of scrutiny rather than comfort. Alexander canceled meetings, postponed deals worth millions, and redirected his energy toward his family with an intensity no one had seen before. Independent specialists were contacted discreetly, their reputations built not on marketing but results. Medical records were requested in full, not summarized versions, and reviewed by professionals who had no prior connection to the Reed name. Maria remained present through it all, not interfering, but answering questions when asked, pointing out inconsistencies she had noticed long before. At times, Alexander watched her from a distance, struck by how easily he had overlooked someone so observant. As reports came back, subtle confirmations began to emerge. Certain treatments had indeed been rushed. Financial incentives had influenced recommendations more than he had been led to believe. Symptoms had been managed rather than understood. None of it was blatantly criminal, but it was undeniably negligent. Each discovery chipped away at Alexander's confidence in the system he had trusted blindly. He spent hours sitting beside his children's beds, something he had rarely done before, listening to their breathing, holding their small hands, noticing details he had once left to nurses and machines. Guilt pressed heavily on him, not because he lacked love, but because he had assumed love could be delegated. Maria often stood nearby, unsure of her role now, no longer invisible, yet not fully acknowledged. One evening, As rain streaked down the windows and the mansion felt smaller than ever, Alexander spoke to her again. "Why didn't you just leave without saying anything?" he asked quietly. Maria considered the question carefully. "Because silence would have been easier," she replied. "And easy things are usually the ones we regret." Her answer stayed with him long after she left the room. As weeks passed, new treatment plans were implemented, slower, more cautious, guided by doctors who welcomed questions instead of deflecting them. Progress was not immediate, but it was real. Small improvements appeared: more stable breathing, longer periods of wakefulness, faint color returning to pale cheeks. Alexander noticed every change with a focus he once reserved only for business negotiations. He felt himself changing too, learning to listen instead of command, to observe instead of assume. One afternoon, while reviewing a new set of reports, he realized something that made him pause. The person who had triggered all of this was not a specialist, not an advisor, not someone with influence or credentials. It was the housemaid who had refused to ignore what she saw. The thought humbled him in a way success never had. When Maria later came to update him on the household, he looked at her differently, not as staff, not as a problem, but as a partner in something far more important than wealth. "You did the right thing," he told her simply. Maria lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond. She had not acted for recognition or reward, only because she could no longer bear the weight of silence. Yet in that moment, standing in the study where she had once placed her resignation letter, she felt something shift inside her as well. For the first time, she believed that her voice, no matter how quiet, truly mattered. The change inside the mansion was gradual but undeniable, like dawn arriving so slowly that no single moment could be named as the beginning. Where there had once been tension masked by luxury, there was now a careful attentiveness, a sense that every action mattered. Alexander Reed no longer measured his days by meetings and market closings alone. He measured them by how long his children slept peacefully, by whether their breathing sounded stronger, by the rare but precious moments when they smiled without effort. He sat beside their beds more often than anywhere else, reading reports with one hand while holding a small, warm palm with the other, finally understanding that presence could not be replaced by any amount of money. The doctors who now came and went were different too. They spoke plainly, admitted uncertainty, welcomed questions. Progress was slow, sometimes painfully so, but it was honest, and that alone felt like a victory. Maria watched all of this quietly, continuing her work, yet no longer moving like a shadow. There was a new weight to her steps, not heaviness, but purpose. She still cleaned, still organized, still cared for the household, but she was also consulted, listened to, acknowledged. Alexander often found himself asking her small things at first: what changes she noticed, how the children seemed that morning, whether something felt off. Each question reminded him how close he had come to losing the one person who had seen clearly when everyone else had been distracted by authority and wealth. The day her resignation was meant to take effect arrived without ceremony. No one mentioned it until late afternoon, when Alexander asked Maria to join him in the study, the same room where she had once stood with her back turned, offering her farewell. She entered with a familiar mixture of respect and caution, unsure what this meeting would bring. Alexander was standing, not behind his desk but beside it, holding a folder. He gestured for her to sit, and this time she did not hesitate. He placed the folder on the desk between them and slid it toward her. Inside was a new contract, carefully written, clearly defined, offering her a role that went beyond housekeeping, one built on trust, responsibility, and respect, with a salary that reflected its importance. Maria stared at the pages, her hands trembling slightly as she read. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why me?" Alexander leaned forward, his expression unguarded. "Because you saw what I refused to see," he replied. "Because when leaving would have been easier, you chose to speak." Maria closed the folder slowly, emotion tightening her throat. She had never expected reward, never imagined her honesty would lead here. "I didn't do it for this," she said. Alexander nodded. "I know. That's why it matters." Outside, the mansion seemed to breathe differently now, as if the walls themselves had learned to listen. Days turned into weeks, and the children continued to improve, not miraculously, not suddenly, but steadily. Laughter returned in small bursts, first cautious, then more confident. The sound echoed through hallways that had long known only hushed footsteps and worried whispers. Alexander found himself smiling at ordinary moments, shared meals, quiet conversations, evenings without emergency calls. He had lost nothing by stopping Maria that day, he realized. Instead, he had regained something priceless: clarity. Maria, too, changed in ways she hadn't anticipated. She spoke more openly, not only to Alexander but to others, encouraging a culture of attention and care rather than fear. She understood now that her voice did not need permission to exist. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky beyond the windows in soft gold, Alexander stood beside Maria in the hallway, watching his children talk animatedly with a nurse. "I spent years believing power meant never being questioned," he said quietly. "Now I know it means knowing when to listen." Maria smiled gently. "Sometimes the truth comes from the quietest place," she replied. The mansion no longer felt like a monument to success, but a home shaped by humility and awareness. And it all traced back to a single moment: a folded letter, a decision to speak, and a man who chose, just in time, to stop her from walking away.